You are standing in a city that has never been broken into. 800 years, 8 centuries in which every army that came for Rome was turned away, absorbed, or destroyed. 800 years of the walls meaning something, absolute. The idea that there are places on earth that cannot be reached, cannot be entered, cannot be taken. Tonight, that idea ends. It is the night of the 24th of August, 410 AD, and historians still argue over who has opened the Salarian gate from the inside. By dawn, Alaric's army is walking through the streets of Rome, not running, walking. The measured, unhurried movement of men who know they have won, who are moving through the marble corridors of the most powerful civilization in human history and taking what they can carry. 1,500 miles away in Bethlehem, a scholar named Jerome receives the news. He stops mid-sentence. His hand stops moving. He writes only this: "My voice sticks in my throat. Sobs choke my utterance. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." In North Africa, a bishop named Augustine stares at the horizon and begins rewriting everything he believes about God, empire, and time. He will spend the next 13 years answering the single question this night has placed in every Christian mind. How could this happen to the eternal city? Here is the answer nobody taught you. What happened in Rome on the night of the 24th of August, 410 AD, this is not the fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire will not officially fall for another 66 years, and when it does fall, nobody in Rome will even notice. This is the true story. This content exists in a very small corner of YouTube. The feed rarely surfaces the same corner twice. Subscribe if it's the kind of history you've been looking for.
The year is 476, September. A boy who calls himself Emperor of Rome sits in a palace in Ravenna. Not Rome. Ravenna. He is somewhere between 14 and 16 years old. He has been on the throne for exactly 10 months. He has never commanded a battle, never written a law, never governed so much as a single province. A general walks into the palace. His name is Odoacer. He is the son of a Hunnic nobleman who served Rome. He commands an army of foederati, federated soldiers, barbarians who have been fighting and dying for the empire for a generation. He has more military experience in a single year than this boy will accumulate in a lifetime. He sits across from the emperor, and he tells him it is over. He does not kill him. He does not burn the palace. He does not sack the city. He packs the imperial regalia into a chest, the crown, the purple robe, the symbols of the Roman Imperium, and sends them east to Constantinople, to the Emperor Zeno. The letter that accompanies the chest says, in effect, there is no longer need for a separate emperor in the West. One emperor is enough. The empire is yours. Romulus Augustulus is exiled to a comfortable villa in southern Italy. He lives there for many years. He may have died of old age. That is how the Western Roman Empire ends. Not with fire, not with screaming. With a chest, a letter, and a very comfortable villa. In Constantinople, Emperor Zeno receives the regalia and nods. From his perspective, nothing fundamental has changed. There is still one Rome. It is where it has always been, in the East. In Rome itself, the old city, the senators, the priests, the markets, the day passes normally. No one writes in their diary that the empire ended, because from where they stood, it hadn't. To understand what died in 476 and what didn't, you need to understand what Rome actually was. Not the city, not the Colosseum, the idea. At its peak, the Roman Empire stretched from the northern border of Scotland to the edge of the Sahara Desert, from the Atlantic coast of what is now Portugal to the banks of the Euphrates in modern Iraq. 65 million people under a single legal system, a single currency, a single language of administration. 40,000 miles of paved road connecting every corner of the known world. Engineers who built aqueducts that carried fresh water across mountainous terrain into the hearts of cities. They invented waterproof concrete. They built deep water harbors that are still in use today. They standardized weights and measures across a territory larger than the continental United States. The Mediterranean Sea was not an ocean. It was a Roman lake. A Roman citizen in London could travel to Alexandria, to Antioch, to Jerusalem, and find the same courts, the same laws, the same monetary system. Could write a contract in Latin that was enforceable anywhere the eagles flew. Could stand before a magistrate in any city on 3 continents and be heard. This was not simply power. This was a civilizational architecture, a framework of institutions that held 65 million lives in some coherent relationship to one another. And frameworks, when they collapse, do not disappear overnight. They fracture. They distribute their weight into whatever structures are strong enough to absorb it. They become the bones of everything that comes after.
Empires do not fall in a day. They bleed out over generations, while the people living inside them tell themselves everything is still fine. Rome's dissolution begins not in the 5th century, but in the 3rd, the crisis of the 3rd century. 150 years before 476, the empire fractures from within. In the space of 50 years, the empire produces more than 50 emperors. Most of them are assassinated within months of taking power. Civil wars run simultaneously in multiple provinces. Plague kills 1/3 of the population of some cities. Trade routes collapse. Tax revenue collapses with them. The silver in the coins is quietly being replaced with bronze. The government hopes no one will notice. Everyone notices. By the time Diocletian stabilizes the empire in the 280s, he does it by splitting it in two. 2 emperors, 2 capitals, 2 bureaucracies. The empire is already too large, too expensive, too fractured to be administered from one center. Then Constantine moves the eastern capital to Constantinople in 330, and this is the decision that determines everything. The wealth follows him east, the trade routes, the best generals, the best engineers, the most productive agricultural land, all of it tilts toward the Bosphorus. The western half is left to manage itself. With dwindling revenues, with legions that need to be paid with money that isn't there, with frontiers, the Rhine, the Danube, thousands of miles of border that need to be defended by soldiers that treasury can no longer afford to recruit. The solution is the foederati, barbarian soldiers fighting for Rome paid in land instead of gold. Men who are loyal not to an emperor they have never seen, but to the general who pays them and feeds their families. Rome is outsourcing its survival, and the men doing the surviving are not Romans. And then the Huns arrive.
The Huns drive the Germanic peoples westward. Entire nations, hundreds of thousands of men, women, children, move at once, pressing against the Roman frontier, desperate, armed, with nowhere to go. In 376, a massive Gothic population petitions the Eastern Emperor Valens to cross the Danube into Roman territory as refugees. Valens says yes. His administrators exploit them, steal their food, sell their children into slavery. The Goths revolt. In 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Gothic cavalry destroys the Roman field army. Emperor Valens dies on the battlefield. His men search for his body for 3 days. They never find it. The Emperor of Rome dies in a ditch that no one can locate. It is the worst military defeat the empire has suffered in 2 centuries. Nothing is ever the same again.
The next century is a slow education in what happens when an empire can no longer keep its own people safe. We return now to the night we opened with. 410, Alaric at the dates. What you need to understand about this moment is its theological scale. This is not simply a military defeat. Rome is the Christian empire since Constantine. The Church has staked its credibility on the idea that God's favor rests on Rome, that Rome is eternal because it is chosen. When the Salarian Gate opens, it is not just a city that falls, it is a theology. The sack lasts 3 days. Alaric's forces loot the treasury, strip the storehouses, take captives. They do not burn the great churches. The churches of St. Peter and Paul are declared sanctuary, and Alaric, who is himself a Christian, honors the declaration. 3 days. Then the Visigoths leave. This is the detail that gets quietly erased from the story. They leave. They do not stay to rule. Alaric dies a few months later in southern Italy, fever after a campaign, and his followers move on to Gaul, then Spain. They build their own kingdom. They maintain Roman law. They begin to call themselves Romans. Rome is not conquered. It is visited, but the wound does not heal. It cannot. Augustine spends 13 years writing a 600-page theological argument to explain why God had allowed this to happen. He calls it the city of God. His central argument, the heavenly city and the earthly city are not the same thing. Rome is not the kingdom of God. Rome is just a city. He spends 13 years writing 600 pages to say Rome was always just a city. That is how much this single night costs. 45 years later, in 455, the Vandals come. 2 weeks this time, more thorough. Pope Leo I, there is no emperor with the power to act, walks out of the city gates alone to negotiate with Genseric, the Vandal king. His terms: do not burn the buildings, do not kill the people. Genseric agrees. A pope walking out alone to face an invading army because there is no one else. The pope is now the most powerful man in Rome. And by 472, the empire cannot even hold itself together from within. A civil war, Roman troops besieging Rome, a German general named Ricimer, who controls the puppet emperors he installs and removes at will, sacks the city he nominally serves. Roman soldiers ransacking the city their predecessors died defending. 4 years later, a boy sits in a palace in Ravenna, and a chest is packed.
and history calls this the fall. Here is the question historians have been arguing about for 200 years. Why 476? The Eastern Empire continues. The Emperor Zeno sits in Constantinople and issues Odoacer a title. He recognizes him as administrator of Italy under imperial authority. From Constantinople's perspective, the empire has not ended. It has been rearranged. There is no Roman writer of this generation who describes 476 as a catastrophe. No senator, no bishop, no chronicler writes, "Today the empire fell," because from where they stood, it hadn't. The date 476 was selected a century later by scholars writing backwards from a world that had already changed. It was popularized by the historian Edward Gibbon in the 18th century in his monumental work on Rome's decline because he needed an endpoint. He needed a date that could carry the weight of closure. He chose the deposition of a boy emperor named after a founder and a god. It was a good narrative choice. It was not an accurate one. What we call the fall of Rome is a story invented by people looking backwards through centuries of change and selecting the moment that fit the story they had already decided to tell. It gives collapse a date. It gives civilizational ruin a face, a boy, a general, a letter. It is tidy. It is coherent. It fits on a timeline. It is tidier than the truth. The truth is that empires do not fall. They transform. They metabolize. They distribute their architecture into the structures that outlast them. And Rome distributed its architecture into everything.
While the Western emperor was being sent to his comfortable villa, something extraordinary was happening in every corner of the former empire. The roads were still there. 40,000 miles of Roman road maintained by the Germanic kingdoms that now controlled the territory, because without the roads, everything stops. The Visigoths in Spain used them. The Ostrogoths in Italy used them. The Franks in Gaul used them. Every kingdom that rises from the ruins of Rome inherits its infrastructure and cannot afford to let it decay. The law was still there. Roman law, codified by the Eastern Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, becomes the foundation of every European legal system that will ever exist. French law, Spanish law, Italian law, the legal tradition of every nation that calls itself Western, all of it is Roman law wearing different names, speaking different languages. The language was still there. Latin does not die with the empire. It transforms. It becomes French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian. The Romance languages, Roman languages, are spoken today by more than 800 million people. Every one of them is, in some meaningful sense, still speaking Rome. And the church was still there. This is what the textbooks consistently understate. While the Western imperial administration collapses, the church is already everywhere. Every city that had been a Roman city had a bishop. Every bishop had a network of institutions, churches, hospitals, schools, grain distribution systems, archives, an entire parallel administration built across the bones of the empire, managed by people who could read and write and count. While the emperors fled Rome, moved to Milan, then to Ravenna, then faded entirely from relevance, the Pope stayed.
Pope Leo I, the same man who negotiated with the Vandals in 455, had 2 years earlier walked to the banks of the Minkleo River to face Attila the Hun. Not an emperor, not a general, a pope with no army behind him. He talks Attila out of invading Italy. The most feared military commander in the world turns around and marches home. Leo's weapon is not a sword. It is the accumulated weight of an institution that everyone, even Attila, has decided to take seriously. Slowly, quietly, across the 5th and 6th centuries, the church becomes the administrative infrastructure of the West. Clerics run hospitals, bishops distribute food, maintain legal records, preserve the manuscripts that contain all of Roman history, Roman philosophy, Roman science. The empire has not disappeared. It has been absorbed.
Here is the fact that most Western histories prefer to set aside. Rome did not fall in 476. Rome fell in 1453. The Eastern Roman Empire, which called itself Roman, which issued laws in the name of Caesar, which placed the face of the emperor on its coins, and argued without apology that it was the direct and unbroken continuation of Augustus, survived. It fought, it contracted, it expanded again. It produced emperors and generals and theologians and lawyers and artists. It held the line against Persian armies, Arab armies, Bulgarian armies, Crusader armies, including the armies of the Latin West that sacked Constantinople itself in 1204, in one of the great betrayals of medieval history. It survived for 1,000 years, and when it finally fell, when the army of the young Ottoman Sultan breached the walls of Constantinople on the 29th of May, 1453, the scholars who escaped did not go empty-handed. They carried Roman texts, Roman philosophy, Roman history, Roman medicine, Roman mathematics, manuscripts that the Latin West had not seen in centuries, preserved in Constantinople through every disaster, arriving now in Italian cities that were just beginning to ask the questions these books had already answered. Into Florence, into Venice, into Rome. This migration of Roman knowledge is what triggers the Renaissance, the birth of the modern world, the rediscovery of classical science, the reemergence of humanism, the artistic revolution that gave us Leonardo and Michelangelo and Raphael, is seeded by Roman scholars fleeing the last Roman city. Rome fell in 1453, and in falling, it gave birth to everything we call modern.
You live in Rome. You may not call it that, but you do. The legal system that governs you traces directly to Roman law. The calendar you use, the months named for Roman gods and Roman emperors, is a Roman calendar, reformed by Julius Caesar, adjusted by Pope Gregory in the 16th century. The English language you are hearing right now carries Latin inside it, not metaphorically, literally. Approximately 60% of English vocabulary derives from Latin, either directly or through the Romance languages. Nation, constitution, justice, senate, law itself, all of them Latin, all of them Roman. The university system was built by medieval scholars to preserve and transmit Roman knowledge. The Catholic Church, 1.3 billion members, the largest institution on earth by some measures, is the most direct institutional continuation of the Roman state ever constructed. Its legal system is Roman law. Its administrative hierarchy is the Roman imperial bureaucracy with different titles. Its official language, until the 20th century, was Latin.
Even the word pontiff, Pontifex Maximus, was a Roman priestly title. Julius Caesar held it. Augustus held it. Every emperor after Augustus held it. Now it belongs to the Bishop of Rome, who lives in the city the Caesars built, conducting ceremonies in their language, governing through their institutional forms. Rome did not fall. It became the world. The question historians should have been asking is not, when did Rome fall? The question is, has Rome ever stopped? And the uncomfortable answer, looked at honestly, is no. Every nation that calls itself Western is making a claim about Rome. Every legal principle, every legislative body, every institution of higher learning, every church that calls itself Christian, these are Roman institutions. They survived the bureaucratic transition of 476. They survived Alaric and the Vandals and Attila and the Huns and the collapse of the treasury and the end of the legions. They are still running. A boy emperor was quietly deposed in a palace in Ravenna. The world continued. Not because empires are eternal, but because the ideas that make civilization possible, law, shared language, institutional memory, the belief that the individual can be protected by structures larger than any single man, do not die with the people that built them. They transfer, they are absorbed, they grow into different shapes and call themselves new names. Rome did not fall. It became the world. And that should trouble anyone who believes that the institutions of their own time are too important, too embedded, too necessary to ever be truly lost. The Romans believed exactly the same thing.